Dies ire, dies illa, solvet seclum in favilla, teste David cum Sibylla. Quantus tremores futurus, quando iudex est venturnus, punctat stricte discussurus. Tuba mirum spargens solum, per sepulcra regionum, cogit omnes ante tronum. Nostrum benit et natura, cum resurget creatura, iudicanti responsura. Liber scriptus proferetur, in quo totum continetur, unde mundus judicetur. Iudex ergo cum sede nebit, quid latet apparebit, nibi multum remanebit. Quid sum misertum dicturus, quem patronum rogaturus, convixius tuus sit securus. Rex tremende majestatis, qui salvando salvas gratis, salva me fons pietatis. Prego.
And we are live. Hello everyone. How is everyone doing? So today we're going to be talking about scriptures. This in my hand is an NRSV Bible. And it cannot be understated how important the scriptures are. Of course, the Bible is an excellent source of wisdom. It's 73 books and not only filled with prophecies of our Lord, but also with specific advice for day-to-day matters, songs, prayers, and so much more. It is extremely important. And so that's why I have found it necessary to make a stream on this book, but also to talk about some of the ways that some people take it too far. So, to respond to the question of, I've heard about the explosion, I'll answer the questions about the explosion in Beirut in the question and answer section, because it's quite a big thing. So we won't do that right now. Now, of course, the Bible is a great source of wisdom, but there are many things that we should be doing with it that we can learn from, not only from Protestants but also from the monastic tradition, and that is we need to be focusing as Catholics a lot more on reading the Bible, because we don't have the same habit down, and we certainly don't shout about it quite so much as Protestants do. They live their lives by the Bible extremely strongly. Now, we'll talk about interpretations later, but that is something that we ought to copy, because while we have something like 28,000 saints and St. Thomas Aquinas and the Church Fathers and all of these theologians, which Protestants also have some as well, the Bible is really the root of all of it, in some sense. I mean, really, the Church is the root of all of it, but the Scriptures are the part of what is known as the infallible magisterium that we have. These writings are inerrant, and so they should be treated with a certain level of respect which goes above all other things that aren't inerrant. So doctrine, of course, would be inerrant as well, and the consensus of the Church Fathers. But the Scriptures need more respect. And let me give you a motivation to study it, beyond just learning the Bible, as you probably should anyway. One thing that you can do, particularly if you're a traditional Catholic, so you are very much interested in the Douay-Rheims version of the Bible, which is the version translated from the Latin Vulgate, is that you can take two Bibles, one in one language and one in another, and if you're sure that they're based on the same rough translation, you can learn one language from the other. So, for example, you could take an NRSV like I have in my hand right now and find an equivalent Spanish Bible, and then learn Spanish based on the equivalence of the verses. In fact, something similar is how St. Thomas and the Scholastics learnt Latin. They had somebody who was a Latinist near them, a version of the Vulgate, and they would teach them the meanings of the words based on the different verses and how they would sound in the vulgar language that they'd have, so some form of vulgar Latin usually. Now, you could also do this, as I'm doing, with the Douay-Rheims Shalona, which is the typical Douay-Rheims translation that we have, and with the Vulgate, and then from there build up a Latin ability. But that is something to consider, and I really want to put that out there, because not only will you be doing the same kinds of prayers that a lot of the monastic people did, a lot of the monastic saints did, like St. Bernard of Clairvaux and Grego II of the Carthusians, but not only will you be praying, but you'll also get the secondary benefit of knowing the language of the tradition, whether you take a version of the Hebrew Scriptures or Greek Scriptures or Latin Scriptures to go alongside your English translation. So that's just something that I want to point out here. There needs to be more emphasis on the Scriptures, and I think that that's one good way of beginning to get information. Also, guys, if you could share this, I'd very much appreciate it and like it, because it there's always a problem of the streams not getting out to other people because of course, the way YouTube is working. So, moving on, we should talk a little bit about some of the authors of the Old Testament, because there is no New Testament without the Old Testament, and what this actually means. Now, the first very important thing is that the first 5 books of the Old Testament are authored by Moses. It is heretical to say otherwise. We can see this in the Syllabus of Errors. Those 5 books being Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. Those books are authored by Moses. In addition, you have Joshua and Judges, which are subsequent books which are written by Samuel. You have Jeremiah writing 1 through 4 Kings. For those who are using a Protestant translation, that's 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings. Most people are using the Protestant numbering for that, but if you have a Douay-Rheims, it will be 1 through 4 Kings. And then the prophets are generally written by the prophets themselves, with one exception potentially, and that would be the book of Jeremiah, which could potentially be written by Baruch. You have the Solomonic literature, which is 5 books, those being Ecclesiastes, the Song of Songs, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Song of Songs, Ecclesiasticus, which is otherwise known as Sirach, which is apocryphal according to the Protestants, but deuterocanonical according to the Church, and then the Wisdom of Solomon. The first 3 books there are written by Solomon, the other 2 aren't. Sirach is written by Jesus ben Sirach, and the Song of... not the Song of Songs. And the Wisdom of Solomon, I can't remember the name of the author. I don't think anyone knows. It's important to establish this authorship of the particular books according to the tradition, because if you don't do this, you end up running into problems later on, as many of the Protestants do while they're unaware. So, I want you to think a little bit about the Scriptures, aside from all that I've said. What is the one part of a Protestant Bible, and I think the Protestants have to acknowledge this as well. What is the one page in every Protestant Bible that is not divinely inspired, that is in every Catholic Bible and is indeed divinely inspired? Well, it's pretty simple. The contents page. The contents page is divinely inspired in the Catholic Bible because we have councils backing it. Protestants don't. So how do they back it up? Well, I mean, they obviously don't. But we can talk about some reasons why Protestants have the canon the way that they do and why Catholics have it in a different way. Why do we have more books? Did we just add them to the Bible? Well, let's talk a little bit about church history. The contents page. Yeah, as people in the chat can see. Now, at the time of Christ, the Scriptures weren't actually hard in canon. There was no canonization in the way that we have it today. There were three different groups of Jews, according to Flavius Josephus, but I'm specifically getting this from John Bergsma, who wrote a lot on the Dead Sea Scrolls and their relations to the Gospels. The Sadducees, which only held the 5 books of Moses to be scriptural, so those being Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You have the Pharisees, who held that effectively the Old Testament, as the Protestants have it, is the canon. And then you have the Essenes, that held that there were a lot more works. A lot of them are still apocryphal according to Catholics, books like First Enoch and others. Now, it's important to mention that this is seemingly only in the Holy Land when John Bergsma makes this account, because the oldest Old Testament translation that we have in existence is not in Hebrew, it's in Greek, and it is the Septuagint translation. And this has all of the books that are in the Catholic Old Testament and a couple more. It has the Prayer of Manasseh, which is the 151st Psalm, and 3rd Maccabees, which has been determined to be false. Now, the Orthodox do hold this, but the non-Ethiopic Orthodox, the Ethiopic Orthodox have an entirely different canon, but the Orthodox, generally speaking, just hold the Septuagint. But we don't. We've taken away a couple of those books for a number of reasons. But the Protestants don't. Now, where do they get their canon from? Well, Martin Luther and many of the humanists, generally speaking, discovered the Hebrew Scriptures through the Jews at the beginning of the 16th century. And they began to work their way through. And, of course, one of these assumptions that came out of the Middle Ages was that the Hebrew was the original first language. And so they prized these Hebrew Scriptures from Jews above the pre-existing Vulgate translations that were generally used, St. Jerome's Vulgate, and the Septuagint versions, which weren't quite so widespread in Western Europe. And a lot of the humanists found that there were differences between the Masoretic Hebrew translations that are in Protestant Bibles, or maybe not all Protestant Bibles now, but in the Protestant Bibles of the time. So, for example, the King James Version is based on Masoretic manuscripts. They discovered differences, and because of their attitude towards Hebrew, which of course was understandable, they decided to opt for a Jewish canon instead. Now, when was this Jewish canon established? Well, according to tradition, the Council of Jamnia was held in 80 AD, and this is where the Jews finalized their canon, and they have it essentially as the Protestants do. And if I'm to quote Father John Harden, the major deciding factor was whether or not the scriptures were in Hebrew themselves, and they deliberately excluded the books that were in Greek. So, for example, the books that we have now in, say, Sirach. Sirach is a Greek book. So is the Wisdom of Solomon. I mean, obviously, Sirach was originally written in Hebrew and Aramaic, as far as I remember, but the one that we have now is in Greek. Let me think of another example. First and Second Maccabees were in Greek, and so they were excluded, even though they play quite a big part in Jewish tradition. That's where we get Hanukkah from. King James is based. No, he wasn't based. Why do the Orthodox have more books? They just sort of took the Septuagint as writ. That's why, and we didn't. But to continue with what we were saying, the Protestants get it from the Council of Jamnia, which was established by the Jews. Now, the problem is, and this is the same problem with the Pharisees, is that they have no authority to enforce this. There is no reason at all why we should take the Council of Jamnia over, say, Philo of Alexandria's particular opinion, or even the Gnostics. And this is where we enter into another very important part of history and what led to the defining of the New Testament canon. And that was the Gnostic groups that existed in the 2nd century. There were other groups as well, like the Ebionites, but the primary group of interest are the Gnostics. And what they would do is that they would invent their own gospels. You may have heard of some of these: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas. I'm sure many of you who watch the History Channel have heard of the Gospel of Judas. These were all Gnostic gospels, and they were all forged. They are not divinely inspired scripture. They never were, but they were forged. And so this left a very serious problem. And so there are a number of different responses to various Gnostic groups. Marcionites would be one, the Valentinians would be another, by the Bishop of Lyon, a guy called Saint Irenaeus. And he wrote a book called Adversus Heresies, or Against Heresies. And this is the first formal definition we have from anybody of the New Testament canon. Now, the fact that St. Irenaeus said it doesn't make it binding fact. We have councils later on that do this. But he sets this forth, and this is largely taken as writ. Because, and we can see this, in fact, this calling out of these Gnostic attitudes in the epistles of the New Testament. But this is generally taken as writ. The 27 books that we have in the New Testament, they were effectively first established by St. Irenaeus. Now, St. Irenaeus knew Polycarp, who knew John. So we have a pretty stable foundation there already, if we were to just use reason. But reason itself is not sufficient reason to decide whether or not something is divinely inspired. It requires a certain level of authority. Otherwise, we'd be doing things like accepting the Book of Jasher as a canon, when that was actually a 17th century forgery. Now, the oldest Christian writing, to the best of my memory, that we have on the Old Testament, and bear in mind this gets overruled later on, but I'm saying it for completeness, is Saint Melito of Sardis, who was writing at the close of the 2nd century, and he advocated a canon that was essentially the one of Jamnia. Now, what doesn't really follow with this is that at the same time you had the deuterocanonical books being used quite a lot in the church. In fact, Sirach's other name, Ecclesiasticus, refers to the fact that it was a church book. It was often used in church. But in spite of this, Melito of Sardis didn't put it in the canon. And there was a lot of debate over what would actually constitute the Old Testament. The New Testament was effectively settled very quickly, but the Old Testament had a lot of debate. People were, of course, alright with the proto-canon, the the biblical books that the Protestants use. But there was a lot of debate over what we call the Deuterocanon. Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Baruch, and the Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, as I've mentioned. And also additions to the Book of Esther and the Book of Daniel. So there was a lot of debate, but this was eventually resolved. There are a number of different councils that did this, but the one that we want to focus on is the Council of Carthage. There were a number of different councils of Carthage. I'm referring to one at the close of the 4th century, around, I think it was 399 or 402 or something like that. And this is where the final canon was effectively decided. And you had the Deuterocanonical books added to the Bible, or put into the New Testament, Old Testament even, and considered divinely inspired. This is where the effective final decision happened, although it was formally dealt with at the Council of Trent in 1563. And of course, Protestants will look at this and say, well, we have previous people who support the proto-canon and such. Why don't we listen to them? Well, because the church decided, first of all, and second of all, because there was a lot of debate. There were people who considered the Deuterocanon to be divinely inspired, as we hear from the Essenes, for example, who were a legitimate group of Jews that often didn't get on well with the other groups, but they still had divine inspiration. Also, we can overrule the Council of Jamnia's assumption that simply because the book is in Greek, it can't be divinely inspired, because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. And a number of books, specifically Sirach and Tobit, have been discovered in the scrolls, and these books are in Aramaic. We didn't have these before, and Aramaic appears to be fine according to the Council of Jamnia, because a large chunk of Daniel was written in Aramaic. That's one reason why we'd accept it. The second opposition that you will often hear is, well, the guy who wrote the Vulgate didn't even like the Deuterocanon anyway. And they will cite his arguing against it being placed in the Old Testament. Trouble is that after the Council of Carthage, and after the papal approval of this same Saint Jerome not only says that the Hebrew manuscripts are not the only manuscripts that should be relied on. The Septuagint should be as well in his book Contra Rufinum, but he also starts citing them as well as sacred scripture. In one letter, for example, he cites the book of Sirach to prove a point. Taylor Marshall actually has a pretty good article on this. And the third opposition that we'll often get out of Protestants, in spite of there being debate and this debate being resolved within this church in the same way that Christology was resolved. In fact, the canon was resolved before Christ was considered both man and God. In fact, 50 years beforehand. Is they will say, well, there was this silence. The scriptural books had to be written by prophets, and there were no prophets between Zechariah and John the Baptist. So they will say, well, the divine inspiration stopped around 430 BC, and it began suddenly again with St. John the Baptist. And they will say things like, well, the proto-canon is composed entirely of prophetic works, or something to that extent. I've heard this out of a Baptist before, who will say, well, there was no prophets about with say 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and therefore they're invalid. Now, there are a few problems with this. First of all, Baruch, the book of Baruch, was written before the death of Zechariah. It was written around 580 BC. And so this doesn't stand up for that reason. Secondly, there are a number of books in the Old Testament that they have that aren't written by prophets. For example, if we just consider the proto-canon on its own, there's good reason to believe that Jeremiah was written largely by Baruch, and he was a scribe. So if we consider that in exclusion of the book of the prophecy of Baruch, there would be no reason to assume that Baruch was indeed a prophet himself. And so you have a scribe writing this. So it was his pen that was inspired, not Jeremiah's. But aside from that, there's even more pressing issues. For example, the authorship of Job, we don't know it. There's no reason why it would be a prophet. Also, the book of Esther. In fact, the Jews debate Esther a lot. There's no prophet that wrote that either. We don't know the author. Also, parts of the Psalms, not written by prophets. In fact, I seem to remember, I think it's by the waters of Babylon, which is something like, I think it's Psalm 136 or 134, explicitly mentions how there's no prophet to guide them. So you can assume that the psalm that was written there was written by someone who wasn't a prophet. The Psalms themselves weren't all written by David. In fact, you see this argument from St. Alphonsus Liguori in his commentary on the Psalms. And also, there's another argument that runs something like this. Again from St. Alphonsus Liguori. Well, you look at the age of the Masoretic manuscripts used for books like the King James Version, and it turns out that they are not only 800 years newer than the Septuagint, but also they write in a different form of Hebrew than would have been used around, I want to say it's around the time of Christ, but I'm not sure, or certainly around the time that they were writing, say, the Torah. You can actually see the inscriptions in early Hebrew, and it's a very different set of characters that is used, or abjaz. And so, Alphonsus Liguori says that, well, they've added all of these vowel points and completely changed up the script, and indeed actually changed the content, so why would we consider these divinely inspired? In fact, I want to say it's St. Justin Martyr, who was a 2nd century Christian saint, who was also a philosopher, made this point in his Dialogue of Trypho. The Hebrew scriptures are modified, essentially. That is what he'd argue, and you can point to things like, for example, prophecies being removed in the Psalms, especially, differences in the narrative, or differences in the details even in the Torah, and you also see some of the prophecies being removed and changed in the book of Isaiah. There's actually a really nice chart that you can Google, and it will show you in pretty stark detail some examples of these. So you can't rely on the argument of, well, the prophets went silent, therefore the Deuterocanon doesn't work. Second of all, you can't rely on language, because there are books in the Deuterocanon that are decidedly not written in Hebrew or Aramaic, and so they should be included, and with them all the theological implications that you might have to bring in. For example, guardian angels are from Tobit. And finally, you can't really use this with the proto-canon anyway, so it's kind of a silly argument to make. Now, I'm sure there are more intelligent arguments, but I haven't come across them myself. The decided impression I get is that, if aside from the pre-existing tradition that the Catholic Church the Catholic Church had, the pre-existing tradition there, coupled with this Protestant, or this Jewish edition at the beginning of the 16th century, is the only reason why the contents page is the way it is in a Protestant Bible. There's seemingly no reason or no distinguishing authority to determine why someone should listen to, say, Saint Melito of Sardis over Valentinius. And in fact, the very St. Augustine that is so beloved by Protestants even says in one of his works, I think it's one of the works against Pelagius, he says, well, the only it's not, it's against Faustus. It's against the Manichaeans. He says, well, why would I believe the gospel if the church, aside from if the church preached it? And you see, that's exactly the problem with Protestantism. They assume that because two people together can have a divine presence, that it's an inerrant presence. And if they looked at the thousands of denominations that they have with their various opinions, they'd see that this was very wrong very quickly. But I admit, this is probably a very shallow view of the Protestant arguments. But aside from that, it doesn't really make any sense, and I haven't had a Protestant who can come up with a better argument for this beyond saying, oh, the church was wrong somewhere along the way. Which, of course, historically speaking, doesn't make sense, because you can just track the fathers and their writings through the 2nd and 3rd century, and you'll see their consistency. The name of the chart, just type in Septuagint versus Masoretic text, Old Testament differences, and you'll see them. So you'll find that there, Charlie Adams. Okay, so that was just a very brief thing. The main reason I wanted to talk about this here is because you cannot simply say Scripture alone if you don't know what the Scripture is. You have to have something to define it, and you have to have actual authority, not just preferences of scholars. Preferences of scholars don't work in something like determining the Word of God. It has to come from a mystical body, and the mystical body is, of course, the Church. And as we learn from the works that were almost placed into the New Testament finally in these councils, like First Clement and the epistles of St. Ignatius, that the reality of the early church is in fact very different from what, say, Presbyterians would want us to think. So I'm gonna take some time off, and I'm gonna let you ask your questions. I'll be back in a few minutes. I hope you're finding this useful. If anybody wants any more explanations as to what I've said, or any additional talking about the Bible, because I've just got these very basic notes here, but really the Bible is fascinating, please do stick them in the chat and on the Riot server at riot.renaissancemen.xyz. That is riot.renaissancemen.xyz. One. Okay, hello. Let's have a look at the questions. Also, thanks to NotCL for posting in the questions chat on the Riot server the chart that I was talking about. If you want to see the chart, it's in the questions room. So go and have a look. It's quite enlightening. I don't have Twitter, by the way, Charlie Adams. So, what's your opinion on the explosion in Lebanon? Do you think Israel did it? I don't know, but I may well be proven wrong here in future, and so I don't really have any particular attachment to this opinion. But when they say that it was just 50 tons of explosives, and it shattered windows 15 miles outside of Beirut, it doesn't really make much sense to me. I think it was probably more. Aside from that, please pray for them. That's what they need. I mean, it's being compared to Hiroshima and Nagasaki for a reason. Let's continue with the questions. Also, it definitely wasn't fireworks, at least primarily. Question for the Q&A. Do you have a paper copy of the Summa Theologiae? And if so, which one? Do you recommend your copy of it? I have a few volumes of the Summa. One from the late 1950s that was translated by some English Dominicans. I specifically have the ones from the Secunda Secundae Partis on the nature of virtue. But those are the only ones that I've found so far. I haven't really been tracking them down. You see, I have this lovely little second-hand bookshop that's near my house in my uni town, and they have all these really good theological works. So I once saw the entire Summa Contra Gentiles there. I have crates and crates of books from there as well. I have the complete works of Flavius Josephus looking at me right now, Plotinus, Augustine, Pascal. They really did have some really good stock on theological books, but I don't have the Summa beyond those three little volumes there. One page is in English, one page is in Latin, which I think would be a very interesting project in future to study. What version of the Bible? The one that I have in front of me here. Well, actually, I have 3 Bibles on this desk. I have the NRSV in my hand. Behind my computer is a Douay-Rheims Shalona and a Clementine. I think it's Clementine Vulgate. Let me check, because I've been studying the Psalms in Latin today. Editio Quinta. Let's see. It's a German one because a friend of mine from Germany got it for me. Juxta Vulgata Versionen. Let's see. Sanctus Spiritus. Yeah, I think this is it's from Deutsches Bibelgesellschaft in Stuttgart. So that is Deutsche Bibelgesellschaft, which I think this is just straight St. Jerome's. It might be Clementine though. I'm not sure. It's certainly not. I'm pretty sure it's not Nova Vulgata though. Moses predicted his own death. So a lot of saints do that. Why do the Eastern Orthodox have more books? As I said earlier on, because they just took the Septuagint. Sorry, I'm just laughing at the comment below from Andrew Gilchrist. Isn't that a joke from Charles Colomb? I just can't get thoughts of the 13th floor out of my head now because of that. It's such a good show. You guys should watch Off the Menu. I was putting it off. In fact, I might actually get a kind of a co-host or get some guests on here, because if this is going to be a regular thing, might as well have discussions on here. And the banter between Vincent Franchini and Charles Colomb is just so entertaining. It really brightens up my Mondays. Dr. Brant Petrie has a lot about Jamnia being made up, if you're interested in looking up. Yeah, I've heard it's a hypothetical council, but for the sake of this, I'm going to take it as existing, because I don't know better. What do you think of young Earth creationism? Well, you see, the word Yom in Hebrew doesn't necessitate it being a single day. Because it can't just be a single day, because it was the 3rd day that the Earth was created. So it can't just be necessarily 24 hours. Now, how much wiggle room you give that I don't know. I'm not a scripture scholar. I know that the consensus of the fathers, I think it was the consensus of the fathers that it was. Was there ever consensus? I think it's consensus of the fathers that it was, 7 literal days. But I don't quote me on that. In fact, definitely don't quote me on that, because that means that has infallible power, and I'm not sure. But yeah, I'm not sure. I'm. You see, the thing is that scientists will talk about things with a great deal of certainty, and they always have done since the 16th and the 17th century. And they often turn out to be wrong about a lot of things. In fact, I think one of the biggest examples of this is the physicalist crowds. Yet, at the same time, I actually don't know on this one. I would have a tendency. Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to say, because if I say something, yeah, I don't want to say. Because I don't actually know. I might be wrong on the consensus of the fathers here. I heard the squabble over leavening in the Eucharist has its roots in scriptures. My question is, where exactly in the scriptures? I can't exactly remember, but I know for a fact that this was resolved at Ferrara Florence. It was decided that it didn't matter, and it may have even been resolved before that. It may have even been resolved at Second Leon. These are medieval councils, by the way. Ferrara Florence was in the 15th century, the early 15th century, and Second Leon was in the middle of the 13th century. In fact, St. Bonaventure was taken there on the express command of the Pope. So, yeah. I don't know Earl of Grey or Serf of Grey. Can you elaborate on why the King James Bible is one of the worst versions out there and should be avoided? Well, all Protestant Bibles should be avoided. Not because they were on the index, necessarily, but because they're based on manuscripts that aren't very good. They're based on Masoretic manuscripts, which are a lot younger in their pedigree than the primarily Septuagint-based ones and the primarily Vulgate-based ones, because St. Jerome had access to older Hebrew manuscripts that were floating around in the 2nd century, for example, that we simply don't have now. Theodotion and Aquila spring to mind. Symmachus is another one that Jerome had access to when he made the Vulgate, which we don't now. Whereas with the King James, they had Masoretic manuscripts, which were more contemporary with the time. And in fact, if I remember correctly, the Masoretic version comes from the 6th century. I actually had somebody, I had not CL tell me that it came from 150 AD, but still same difference, right? You have older versions, and you have a synthesis of these older versions in a Latin version that is seemingly older than the Masoretic text. So why this was ignored, I'm not precisely sure. I think it was kind of the craze of the humanists. Okay. Thanks for the academic content. My novice opinion on the young Earth creationist thing is that people are making material something that is symbolic. It may well be, right, with days of creation. Actually, I'm gonna look that up now while I'm here, because I'm kind of curious. Because there's no reason why Yom couldn't represent an age, but I'm not sure what the consensus of the fathers is on this. Because if the father said it in consensus, we have to believe it on faith and morals. Okay, so it would appear that Ambrose of Milan believed it. Basil the Great believed it. Okay, so you have Lactantius, who says, "For the great day of God is limited by a circle of 1,000 years, as the prophet shows." Okay, so and like in the sight of in thy sight, O Lord, 1,000 years are as one day. In Psalm 90, but also St. Peter says it, I think, in 1 Peter, where he says, you know, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day, right? So I think, yeah, St. Cyprian says it's 7,000 years. Victorinus doesn't appear to have an actual opinion. I'm just reading this off of a Reddit post. So, I mean, yeah, you see, all I know is that, yeah, you see, Anno Mundi is kind of in debate. In fact, there's actually not a consensus of the fathers. Apparently, it's split. So it's not clear. I don't think that this is something that's necessarily going to be on faith and morals, so I don't think you'd necessarily be heretical either way you took it. But still, distrust scientists, but also very much distrust the fundamentalist Protestant kind of stripe, because they're wrong on a lot of things, both of them. So give consideration. Be very careful of the way scientists think, right? There's this insistence, for example, on heliocentrism, even though relativistic physics actually means that the sun doesn't have to be the center of the universe. So you see, you have to be very careful with what appears to the general public to be scientific consensus and what is actually scientific consensus, first of all, and second of all, scientists are human beings as well, and so are scripture commentators. Didn't Augustine say that we needn't take Genesis literally? I don't know. You have to take it literally insofar as it's inerrant on faith and morals, though. But at the same time, you see, the thing is that if 1,000 years are a day, and a day is as 1,000 years, right? You could say 7,000 years, or you could take it metaphorically. Again, it's a very complicated topic, but it's a very interesting one. You've kind of provoked my attention here. Something I need to read into more. Can you answer that question about God allowing suffering before the fall during evolution? I forgot the way the question is properly written. I actually had to answer this today on a page with a bunch of Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox mixed together. So the scholastics made a distinction between the types of pain and suffering. And this is necessary because in the book of Exodus, in chapter 34, you have the suffering of the sins being visited upon the sons and grandsons, and to the third and fourth generation, or something to that extent. But in Ezekiel chapter 18, you see things like, well, only a man dies because of his sin. And there are some of these not particularly creative, maybe, biblical commentators who will say, oh, well, apparently the Bible contradicts itself, therefore it's not inerrant. Which, if you actually employ creative thinking, first of all, and second of all, read the Fathers, you will find that these contradictions amount to nothing. And this is what I mean. So the first kind of suffering is pain, or called pena in Latin, Poena. And this consists in physical pain. So, for example, a lion eats an antelope. That's part of the lion's nature to eat the antelope. So it's necessitated that the antelope feels pain. This is inherent to nature, and we'd be defective without it. If we couldn't feel pain, for example, if we burn our hand on a hob, we would be defective in nature. In fact, that would be a sign of leprosy. So pain, or pena, is important. However, the kind of pain that Christ got rid of on the cross, the kind of suffering that Christ trampled down, is culpa, which is sin. That kind of suffering that comes from sin is conquered by Christ on the cross, and that is not innate to our nature. Eve chose to bring this into the world through disobedience of God's will, and likewise Adam, of course. And what was it the joke that Blessed Fulton Sheen tells? It was Adam and Cain and Abel when they were little boys walking past the gate of Eden, and Abel asks, "Well, what's over there? Why aren't we living there? It's so beautiful." And Adam goes to Abel and says, "Well, that was when we used to live in there, but unfortunately your mother had to eat us out of house and home." So, that it was the culpa is the problem. If I pinch myself and I don't hurt, I know it's not natural. How long will it take for Protestant churches to finally die off completely? Do you think that it will be possible for the Catholic Church to finally get on the offensive again when that happens? Well, unfortunately, I think it will take another 500 years potentially. Now, granted, I don't think they'll be recognisable in the sense that we have now, but you have to remember that the final Marcionites, who were a heresy of the 2nd century, were still around in the 10th century AD. There are a lot of these Gnostic cults still floating around, and there are still Arians, and there are still Christological heretics. We call them Muslims. So, to say that the Protestant churches per se are already kind of dead. There are very few people who really take John Calvin seriously. And they're sort of being increasingly replaced by this Hillsong happy clappy kind of neo-Pentecostal and neo-evangelical spirit, which isn't, in a lot of ways, isn't really recognisably Christian. They have the cross there, but they don't really place as much emphasis on the cross as they do on spiritual powers acquired through the Spirit. And that's where I think it will go. But I think they'll still be around. Who did Cain and Abel marry, and how many humans were around before the fall? We don't know that, but we know that there were people about. You see, a lot of the problems that people have, and the reason why they will attack, say, Genesis 5's genealogy, is that they will assume, baselessly, that this is exhaustive. And that's another reason why, Cain and Abel were able to marry. Right? There were just women about from Adam and Eve. And I presume that because of the... Well, you see, people were able to live for a very long time. I think it's before Moses. And so we can assume that I guess there wouldn't have really been consanguinity issues, but I'm not an educated scholar on this. I don't know. One compelling idea on the day of creation I've come across is that there can be 6 literal days while also being billions of years due to relativity. I don't have a problem with that, but it's just physics. Physics as a whole is a real mess. Some calculations say it has been 6 days since the Big Bang in the frame of the cosmic microwave background radiation. A lot of the Protestant holdouts are fundy anti-Catholic conspiracy nuts. Yeah, that's true. I'm going to quickly check over to the riot. Are there any German and English Bibles which are comparable for learning German? Well, you obviously don't want to go for a Luther Bible, because that's Luther's Bible. But I'm sure that there are Catholic translations of the Bible in German, and there's probably one directly from the Vulgate, but I don't know for certain. So, if you wanted to learn German, you'd want to pick a relatively modern translation. Specifically a Catholic modern translation, because I made the mistake when I wanted to learn Spanish of getting a modern translation of the Spanish, but it also happened to be a Protestant Bible. So I had problems with it. Not on a theological level, but because it wouldn't fit with my NRSV, which is a Catholic translation. So be very careful when you select a Bible. Pick a modern one, which fits up with your English Bible, but make sure it's one that's actually Catholic. Because you don't want to learn heresy while you're learning German. Don't use an NIV as well, please. Paul van der Clay doesn't seem to take Calvin seriously, and he's a Calvinist, isn't he? Well, I don't know how the Calvinist tradition went, but there's a lot of strange aberrations in Calvinism, right? So you have this strange anti-Catholic massive bent, but then you have Theodore Beza talking to St. Francis de Sales, even not Vincent de Paul. That's a later saint. And he says, it's possible for Catholics to be saved, but we Protestants, we just make it easier. Which is like, well, if the Catholic Church has 1,500 years of tradition behind it, which Beza admitted. I'm getting this from St. Alphonsus Liguori's History of Heresies, by the way. If that's the case, Calvinism, which is something that at that point hadn't even existed for a century, even if it were more difficult, wouldn't you want to place your money more on the tradition first? Wouldn't it just be sensible to do so? I've heard that it's because humanity was cleaner back then, so consanguinity wasn't an issue. Yeah, you see, the thing with the fall is that... How do I put it? You see, genetics aren't strictly deterministic. You can change them through epigenetics. You can adapt certain virtues and perform certain behaviours and increase the quality of your genetic code. Now, if we look at the beginning of Genesis, it would seem to be pretty evident that people were very intent on destroying their virtues in very short order. People like Lamech, of course, Cain specifically, and the Nephilim, right? You had a lot of this happen, and that might be the reason why it happened. I don't know for certain though. I'm like I say, I'm not a scholar on Scripture, and I'm certainly not a scientist. Well, actually, I am a scientist. I have a degree in it. I have a bachelor's of science. What I'm talking about, but I'm not that sort of scientist. What do you think of inspiring philosophy? I don't really have an opinion. The best, but this is according to Felix the monarchist. The best German Bible translation is the Herder translation. Don't buy the Einheitsübersetzung. Is that Einheitsübersetzung? It was made in cooperation with Protestants. We see the NRSV was actually made in cooperation with Protestants, and there was even a Jew involved in the Old Testament. But it's a valid Bible. The Church says it's all right. I think it has an imprimatur here, so it should be fine. Granted, it doesn't have a nihil obstat, which is a little bit troubling, but I've got the do. I tend to... You see, the NRSV is good for just light reading, but if you want to, say, study a direct, more vulgative source, you'd want to look at the Shalona. Although some people say the Shalona's not perfect, and I don't disagree. Explain epigenetics in layman's terms. Essentially, virtue makes you a better person, but it also makes your kids better. There was a book that explained it far better than I ever could, because I can't really remember it. But Deep Nutrition by Dr. Kate Shanahan. That was a book that explained the epigenetic effects of consumption of vegetable oil and refined sugar. But it essentially, there's a reason why people talked of good breeding in the past relative to virtue. So bear that in mind. My old Anglican parish used the NRSV. Yeah, as far as I can tell, I don't know, that there may be differences in wording. So, for example, instead of elder, they might use priest in here, which would be more accurate. But the main difference seems to be that it has the Deuterocanon in it. Will you ever do a stream on Nietzsche? I made a point of reading Nietzsche when I was hungover, and I didn't like what he read. in short, my opinion on Nietzsche is that he wasn't a particularly good philosopher because he didn't really appreciate wisdom. He was more of a rhetorician, and a very depressed one at that. It's necessary to have some understanding of him, but the thing is that he's a very good rhetorician, and people who are first of all not well canonized, and second of all not particularly well versed in the philosophy, could be very easily led astray by him, because he's very blunt, very brash, but also an incredibly good rhetorician. But he makes no pretense to truth, which is often hard to remember. Refined sugar is fine. High fructose corn syrup is bad because of heavy metal and other toxin contaminations. I eat 100 to 150 grams of pure white sugar every day. I don't know, are you trying to debunk what you're saying there, is it all? I don't know, but either way, be careful with what you eat. Sometimes you can't do stuff about it, which is fine, but yeah, still be careful. If you can afford better food, buy better food. I've heard good things about, for example, Chinese markets. They do fresh vegetables very well. They're very into them. But we also have farmers markets in the UK, so we can go to them. Thomas asks, could the schism of the 10 tribes of Israel from the kingdom of the king of Judah be analogous to the schism of the Orthodox? What's the father's interpretation of the story? I don't know the father's interpretation, but that's actually crossed my mind a bunch of times. It might well be. The types in Scripture often repeat themselves. I will say that. I would think that they would actually like to... No, you unironically eat 150 grams of pure white sugar every day. Oh, I don't know how you manage that, but I don't know. I'd love to know why, Isidore, because I can't actually figure out how you could possibly do that. Because you see, I have maybe 3 or 4 teaspoons just across all of the sugar that I put into my tea every day, and I do have some chalk occasionally. But aside from that, yeah. Also, one thing I didn't put on the poll, which is on the communities tab, is that on the last stream I got into a discussion with a fellow who assumed that Plato was automatically lying and an anti-truth or anti-truth. And of course this is ridiculous, but he made clear the root of the problem, and that was Vox Dei. And although I don't think it could, I mean, maybe it could constitute a short video, but I don't think it could constitute a stream. But I think that going after Vox Dei's heuristic that suggests that Plato is somehow anti-truth and leftist and anti-family, yeah, I think that needs to be done. I mean, it sounds like the kind of view that you could only get if you read Plato's Republic alone and didn't bother with the rest of his works. He also explicitly says that Plato's anti-Christian, which just doesn't marry up to reality. And that's the major reason. Chalk. What? Did I say chalk? And why do you think most so-called alt-righters dislike the Catholic Church? Because of its universalism? I would actually think that they actually like it because of that. I thought they wanted to unite white people after all. And you see, I've given up with ethno-nationalism. I'm gonna do a stream on it probably because it seems to be the one that's winning. But yeah, I don't really consider myself much of a nationalist anymore, because every single nationalist I've really talked to in any depth is a lot more interested in posting stuff about crime than actually coming up with a solution to the problem. And when I ask them to say, look at where there's other ethnic replacement going on, for example, the Punjabis in Pakistan are trying to stamp out the minorities there. Africa is filled with this problem. And when I say, hey, look, it's not just white people, it's in other places. And when I say maybe we could learn from these situations throughout history, it's not just white people. I've been met with a lot of anger, as opposed to, hey, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe we could, keep our country's cultures going by looking at the examples of the past and learning from them. But it seems like people aren't interested, and it bugs me to no end. It really bugs me, because if you're presenting this problem and you're making all this sensationalist propaganda to make people frankly angry, then what are you going to do? Just ride off the resentment until someone finally bursts a gasket and there's chaos? Because I don't want that. We've noticed a problem here. We need a reasonable solution. What we don't need is people posting constant news about various crimes. We all know that they're happening. We know that there needs to be a solution, and we can't just get angry about it. It drives me up the wall. I could do a stream with Endeavour, actually. I haven't talked to him in a while, though. I like, for that reason, like, I'm not interested in interacting, like, thinking about nationalism, because if all nationalism is going to do is spin its tyres, get angry, and then all of a sudden one day there's going to be a breaking point and people are going to go nuts, I don't want to be associated with that. Yeah, I don't want to be associated with that at all. I'm tired of, like, I'll be honest, like, the main reason I got involved in right-wing politics is because I saw what was going on with Rotherham and I was disgusted. And that's why I got involved with UKIP, and that's one of the reasons that led up to me being going into UKIP. And I was very angry about it, and, you know, I sat and I thought about solutions. I was also angry as well, and I fed into a lot of the anger that went on when I saw it. Not in an open way, but, like, you know, eventually it reaches a point. Apparently I'm sort of lagging out, but eventually it reaches a point where what's the point in the anger? What's the point in saying, oh, horrible things happened? Yes, obviously horrible thing has happened. Now, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to sit on there on Twitter and post pictures of it and go, oh, this is horrible, we were never asked? Or are you going to say, yeah, that's the past, we need to do something about it? That's my primary contention. They'll say, oh, we'll never get into government, oh, they're holding me down. Then change the social fabric. Make friends with people. Like, these minorities, like, yeah, there's like gangs among them that are causing these problems. Why not make friends and interact with their community and try to get things solved? Because they're not going anywhere. In a lot of ways, Charlie Adams asks, are you proud of your UKIP days, or do you look back and cringe? I made a lot of very good friends through UKIP. And but I look back on a lot of my actions and I kind of cringe, because I was sucked up a lot more into the drama then. I did make like a sizable amount of money off the attention I got over the whole UKIP drama, but I mean, it was a growing process. It was growing pains, and everyone makes mistakes. But I do regret, insofar as it was sinful, what I've done there. And I think a lot of it was a waste of time as well. Because a lot of it was just, well, the EU's gone. Why don't we reform this party into a civic nationalist party with, frankly, although there were a lot of ethno-nationalist elements there, to be honest. But it didn't come to anything, because, well, for a lot of reasons. A lot of it was just the sheer chaos that the whole party was in. The whole internals of the party was... There was no command structure. There was none of that. It was a bureaucrat's nightmare, right? Like, if at least there had been some sort of bureaucracy beyond the central office and a few leaders that were theoretically there, like, it could have ran a lot better. It wasn't a smooth machine. Yeah, the greatest hubris is indeed to think that oneself cannot post cringe. I mean, look at the title of this channel. It's called Renaissance Man. Is that not a cringe name? You see, I accept that it's a cringe name, but it's the only name that I could think of at the time that really encompassed what I wanted to do. Okay, so any tips on focusing for studying? So what you want to focus on when you're reading or studying is the first 5 to 10 minutes. If you can overpower that and force yourself through, then you'll get obviously temptations to put it down and you'll feel tired, but the majority come in the first 5 to 10 minutes. Also, stop indulging in things that improve, like, you know, get you addicted to dopamine. So stop using the screen so much, stop masturbating, stop overeating, stop entertaining lustful thoughts. I mean, obviously these things are sinful, so just stop doing that and draw yourself away from things that cause you to dopamine out, because frankly reading a book doesn't give you much dopamine, and then force your way through it. One of the things, I think the final thing that's kind of driven me over the edge with Latin into actually sitting and reading the scriptures and using it as prayer, is when I realised that the Benedictines considered Lectio Divina a form of penance, and so a form of mortifying the flesh. They literally considered repeating the scriptures over and over again and meditating on them a form of penance, and so it's going to be hard. And when you realise that, and when you realise that it's got benefits to your soul beyond just the reading of the scriptures, it's hard and forces you to focus, and likewise with reading, then it becomes a lot easier, because it's like, okay, I'm going to struggle against this, it's penance, so, you know, I'm supposed to be feeling this way, crack on. Let's see, there are other questions. I see a couple of tags here and there, but here we go. Do you plan to make more tech content in the near future, or perhaps start a tech channel? I've considered it, because, you know, I can talk about the scriptures, and I can talk about Christianity, and I can talk about politics, but really my degree is in computer science. And I can't help but think that people having a greater knowledge of what was actually going on with, say, machine learning and the tech giants, I think that if people actually understood at least the software component, I have a sort of rudimentary understanding of the hardware as well through a computer networks course, but if people truly understood how fragile all this tech was and how it actually worked, I think that there would be a lot more intelligent approaches towards things like, say, cashless societies, which, by the way, are insane. They are absolutely insane. And a much more rational approach to people like Elon Musk. Right? I mean, that's just a bugbear of mine. Like, I don't appreciate what the tech giants are saying, because they make tech seem a lot bigger than it actually is. It bugs me to no end. Britain would have solved many problems if it had embraced the Christianity present amongst the post-World War II immigrants instead of ostracizing them because of race. I mean, we can look back at the mistakes of the past, or we can look to the future, consider those mistakes, and make them better with God's grace. Any thoughts on scapulars? I have a brown scapula somewhere, but I can't wear it because I'm not confirmed. I have blessed green scapulars around. If you pray to the Immaculate Heart, you can help out people who are suffering. I think it's suffering from illnesses and for conversion, right? So the green scapula you don't have to be confirmed to have. Brown scapula you do, and you also have to pray. I think it's the Rosary every day to have it. The promise assigned to it isn't something that's necessarily binding in so much as if you keep the requirements of the scapula, you will be saved. If you pray a rosary devoutly every single day, that's a very strong sign of predestination, for example. I think you can also keep the little office with it. There's a bunch of other ones as well. There's the blue scapula, which is for chastity. Have you practiced effective prayer? I don't want to answer that because I don't want to give people an idea of where I spiritually am. But essentially, effective prayer is when you go into mental prayer but without meditating on anything, and you pray primarily with the will. Baron of Barlingen asks, ways to resist frustration and anger when there is no human cause. It may be my greatest sin, and I have no patience for things not entirely out of my control. Unsure of how to remedy. Well, you see, if it's an interior cause of frustration and anger, which seemingly comes about for no reason, that's likely a demonic cause. Now, pride and anger are not necessary to human nature. They come from demonic temptations. So this has to be acknowledged. And demons despise humility. So if you say something like, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me, a sinner, or you say something like, get behind me, Satan, or something like that, if you call to mind the sufferings of Christ, or you call to mind humility, that will drive them out. So do that, basically. Also, it's a symptom of pride that you get anger. I know, because I really struggle with it, because I'm a tremendously arrogant person. But try and focus on humility. There's a book by, I think it's by a guy called Cajetan, called Humility of Heart. That might be a good thing to read as well. I've got it in my Audible library, but I have to work through a book that a priest gave me first before I get started on it. I've said to myself that I'd do it. Opinion on Nick Fuentes. To be honest, I don't really have one. Is it worth reading Kierkegaard? No. I don't like associating with existentialism. You'd be better off reading other things. Although it might... I don't know. I wouldn't touch it, though. I didn't know you had to be confirmed to whether... Yeah, you have to say the brown scapular promise, Thomas. Yeah. What, you were enrolled by a priest while I wasn't confirmed? Oh. I don't know then. Maybe I'm wrong. But how are you going to Christianise Britain when the religion has taken a huge hit as a result of the racism it was misused with and against the virulent multicultural secularism? Christianity's been dead in Britain for a lot longer than since 1945. What was his name? Peter Hitchens points to 1918, but really it's a lot older than that. The Lambeth Conference, which enabled contraception, was one of the biggest things that killed it. The whole racism thing, I don't know. I don't have a solution to that, but it is a problem that needs one. I was talking with an Eastern Orthodox, and they say that Catholics forget the Novus, the Nous, which is how we talk to God, and we focus too much on the intellect. What does this mean? The intellect is the nous. Nous means mind in Greek, so he doesn't know what he's talking about. I have heard a priest say, pray the litany of the Sacred Heart for off. Yeah, I heard Father Chad Ripperger say that devotion to the Sacred Heart is one of the surest ways for people with anger and pride issues to get over them. Because you're effectively devoting yourself to a sensible representation. Well, I mean, it is truly, of course, the heart of Jesus, of course, but it's a sensible representation of the love of Christ. And love drives out fear, and it also drives out demons, which is what is manifested in anger and pride. Is it wrong to kill in defence in your society? Generally, yes. Would you ever join the British Army? I once applied for the Territorials, but I didn't get in. Not because you see, I thought that I had health problems that I don't actually have. So, for example, I thought I had poor hearing when I don't. I thought that I had problems with breath when really I had like asthma when I actually don't. Right, I might reapply at some point. Okay, so if there are any more questions, make them now, and we'll end the stream. It's actually gone on for a lot longer than I thought. So I saw the numbers. I saw that there weren't that many people that interested. is killing a tyrant wrong? Well, I mean, it depends on the alternative, and it depends what your bishop says. So I guess we'll bring this to a close. I saw the numbers, didn't think that there would be... I didn't think there'd be so few. I thought that more people would tune in. But, well, hey, we still got a good number of people. So, thanks everyone for watching, and I will see you later. Goodbye.